Hi, everyone. My name is Alexander, and I will be hosting today's webinar on Biochar, the second one in the series, which is an opportunity for companies to offset and or reduce their carbon emissions while creating new revenue streams. So first of all, the goal of today's webinar is to educate people who produce biochar or people who have biomass available to evaluate whether or not biochar could be something that's interesting for them. And then to show companies that this is a way to offset their carbon emissions. There will be some overlap with my previous webinar, but there will also be some new things. And I will also admit people while I'm talking. So one moment, please. Good. So first of all, what is the big problem that biochar can help us tackle? And all these participants admit. Good. let's give the last participants 1 minute. Then first of all, I can start by presenting myself. I just spent the last 6 months working on biochar as part of my master's thesis. And then I've been working with the different companies to evaluate how they can make most out of their biochar. So simply, you have a product that you can commercialize, and how can you make the most of it? And this showed me that there is a need to spread out the knowledge to all other people in similar situations. But yes, what is the big problem that biochar can help us to solve? First of all, we are in the middle of climate change, and many people call this climate crisis with good reason. But as it is with all crises, they can be seen as opportunities, because if you help solve the crisis, then you'll provide real value, and this value can then be translated into income. But let's look at how it is today. So greenhouse gas emissions are the main contributor to climate change, and today nature and human both emit 810 gigatons of CO2, or CO2 equivalents. Of that, nature absorbs all the natural emissions and half the human emissions. And this is a constant. So what we've seen so far is that the more we emit, nature continuously absorbs half. This means that the net total will be 20 gigatons of CO2 per year. And then, how do we solve this problem? Well, the solution is quite simple. We need to reduce and remove carbon from the atmosphere. So before, it was okay just to reduce emissions, but we've added so much carbon that it's no longer necessary, no longer enough just to remove. We need to take out carbon. And just to stress this point, we can look at the emissions over the past 800,000 years. Then we can see that the emissions have always been between 190 and 290 parts per million. But in the last 150 years, then there is this anomaly, this peak, and we simply don't know how the climate will respond to this change. So better get back to the normal band as fast as possible. Luckily, there is a lot of attention being given to this problem at the moment, namely through the UN SDGs. Then we have 17 sustainability development goals, and they are an excellent framework for both companies and nations to create goals for how to create a stable climate. Then if we look at some of the investments that are being made and some of the actions, if we take an example from the industry, then we have Delta Airlines, and they are committed to being carbon neutral by 2030. And they said, we'll put $1 billion aside for this. And some part of this money will go to carbon capture and sequestration and to offset the emissions. This is really interesting from a biochar perspective. Then to take a local example, we have DFDS, which is a big maritime sector company. And they just made a large investment in bio-oil. So this shows, and from the production of bio-oil, you also get biochar. So it's interesting once more. If we look at political structures, then we have the new climate law in Denmark, which says that we have to reduce emissions by 70% by 2030, and along with the other EU countries, be carbon neutral by 2050. So what are the actions that accompany this? Well, first of all, we can say that the new finance law put aside 25 billion Danish kroners for funding of the green transition. And even though then we have all these companies, and what are their incentives for having these climate goals? Are they just philanthropic? Maybe so, but at the end of the day, companies need to make a profit. Otherwise, they can't contribute positively to the world. So let's look at some of the financial gains. Well, first off, you reduce expenses. Those could be from carbon taxes, or if you are part of the EU ETS system, it could also be allowances. Then we have many examples of new environmental laws being passed over the last couple of years. And a new law states that you need to reduce sulfur emissions. So if we take DFDS as an example again, we can see they just spent 300 million Danish kroners to reduce the emissions. And if they didn't do that, they would be illegal. A third important point is the CSR strategy, the corporate social responsibility. This can be used to attract and retain customers and employees. We see that this is increasingly important, for example, with labels such as fair trade, organic, which are gaining in importance. And then for employees, to take one example, from a marketing company, offsetting all our employees' carbon footprint was an absolute winner with our employees. It received the Best Benefit Award 2019. So this can mean two things. Either these employees don't have a lot of benefits, or this is increasingly important for an increasing amount of people. So the big question, how do we reduce emissions? We have a factory here, and they produce, for example, CO2. Well, the first obvious solution is simply reduce emissions. To take Delta Airlines as an example again, their new fleet will be 25% more fuel efficient. So that's why we have a big cloud and a small cloud. But this is only possible to a certain point. What do you do with the remaining 75%? This is where carbon offsetting comes into place. And you have two options here. You can catch the emissions at the source. So it's a bit like putting a cap on the chimney and then redirecting the greenhouse gases into some beneficial application. Or you can catch it somewhere else. But as you see, if you catch it here or there, it really doesn't make a difference. And the good thing about catching it here is that you can also benefit the environment. And that's where biochar comes into play. But first off, since a common objection to carbon offsetting is that we just buy good conscience, I just want to show that this is not the case. You can catch it here or you can catch it there. It's the same result. And we need to start thinking in a global scale rather than just local. That being said, it's extremely important to reduce emissions, and it's not enough just to offset. So how do we reduce and offset emissions with biochar? First off, what is biochar? You can see it here. It looks exactly like charcoal, and it can be up to 100% carbon. Sometimes it'll be much less. But the good thing about it is that it can store carbon for more than 100 years. And there are examples of it storing it for hundreds of thousands of years. And we can see this from carbon dating. For this reason, biochar is ideal for CCS, so carbon capture and storage. And because, as we'll see in a moment, there are a lot of beneficial applications beyond the CCS potential, we can call it CCS with beneficial applications. So one concrete example, if we have 4 tons of biomass or biowaste, then if you don't do anything about it, then the grass or the leaves or the branches, they'll naturally degrade and then return carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. So in this example, we have 4 tons of biomass and 3.6 tons of CO2, which goes back to the atmosphere. Instead of this, we can pyrolyze it. So that means to heat it up in the absence of oxygen. Then the mass is greatly reduced, and we can end up with, for example, 1 ton of carbon sequestered in 1.1 ton of biochar. So that means that you have at least minimum removed 3.6 tons of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, but the actual reductions could be much higher, as we'll see now. So for the applications of biochar, you can use it to remove pollutants, you can use it as feed supplements for animals, and you can use it as a soil amendment technique. Basically, all that's good gets better, and all that's bad gets less bad. So here we can see that adding a little bit of biochar to animals' feed will increase the body weight, reduce the FCR, that's the feed conversion ratio. It means you give the animal less food and they grow more. You reduce the methane and CO2 emissions, the egg weight and the milk weight goes up, the amount of pathogens goes down, and the survival rate goes up. So these are really, really great points. If we then look at applying biochar to soil, then if we start here at the tree, there's carbon capture as a benefit. We've seen that already. Reduced nitrous oxide emissions, really important. Reduced methane emissions, really important. And these two are greenhouse gases that are much more potent than CO2. So this is why I said before that the actual savings might be much more than just a factor of 3.6. Then you can have carbon negative energy, and you can have reduced odors. Then if we look below ground, we have improved soil tilth, improved soil fertility, increased soil carbon, and a decrease of nutrient runoff. That means that if you have nutrients such as N, P, and K, when it rains, the nutrients run off into lakes or rivers and make eutrophication, which makes a lot of damage. Then the nutrients stay there and you can release. This means you need less fertilizer and less water. But there's another important point. When you have biomass, you can make biochar, and when you have biochar and put it in the soil, you'll get more biomass because the yield will increase. The worse the quality of soil, the more you get an increase. If you have healthy soil, you might just get a little increase, but this is a positive feedback loop. Now, this was some of the applications, but as you can see in this article, there's 55 uses of biochar, and actually there are many more. So enjoy that. Then, what are the main obstacles? We just saw that there is a lot of positive applications, but in Denmark, there is currently no market with biochar. This is in stark contrast to our neighboring countries, so Sweden, Germany, many European countries, US, Australia. But in Denmark, there's basically nothing. So what are the main obstacles? Well, first of all, when people evaluate the business case, they can't make it economically viable. And this may be the case, but my solution would be that you need to consult an expert because there's just so many things to take into account, as we'll see shortly. So in order to really make a good business case, you need somebody who can take in all the different ways of creating value. Then we need to take into account carbon credits that I'll be sharing today as an extra income source. You can upcycle the end product. That means that when you have biochar, you can make it into a more valuable product. You should take advantage of the public funding, and you can make a CHP, combined heat and power plant. But the last three are covered in my old webinar, and I won't be talking about it today. Connected to the not economically viable, then you have that there is a low biochar demand, and this is mainly due to lack of knowledge about biochar and pyrolysis, and also trust in biochar. So it's hard to be a first mover when you look at all the other people with biomass who are not doing it. Then you don't want to be the first and take the risk. But as soon as you see other people that you can relate to who do it, then you want to do it as well. And then that's why I have this webinar today, to educate all people that are interested and show existing examples. So let's look at the carbon credits. How do you make profit from removing atmospheric carbon? Well, the first initiative is from the UN back in with the Kyoto Protocol, which was effective from 2001 and will be until the end of this year. And there they created two compliance markets. A compliance market means it's legally binding. If you don't do what's expected, then you get a fine. And there are two compliance markets, the cap and trade system and the baseline and credit system. In the cap and trade, then we have the IETS, so that's the International Emissions Trading System. And to take a local example, we have the EU ETS, so the European Union Emissions Trading System. To explain briefly, if a company has an allowance of emitting 10 tons of CO2, but only emits 8 tons, then it can sell the last 2 tons of allowance for another company or a nation, or keep it for next year. And conversely, if you produce 12 tons of CO2, then you need to buy the allowance from someone else. If you don't find anybody who can sell you an allowance, then you pay 100 euros per ton CO2. So this is quite expensive. If you produce 1 million tons CO2 too much, then you have to pay 100 million euros. So these are really serious fines. The other system is the baseline and credit system. And here you can make projects called CDM or JI. And these are projects where you have shown, that you've made reduced emissions. So if you show that now your airplane flies with 25% improved jet fuel efficiency, then you can sell that reduction. So for example, if you've reduced emissions by 2 tons, you can trade those 2 tons on the carbon market. And ideally, the expense of the project will be less than the profit you make. But this Kyoto Protocol will be replaced by the Paris Agreement. And then there are new rules from 2021. And these are still being agreed. So you'll have to listen in on the next webinar in 6 months. And then I'll happily explain what those are about. But they will change these, at least the system B. But as an alternative, we have the non-compliance markets. So these are completely voluntary. In this case, company A can reduce emissions and then sell the carbon credits to company B. And these voluntary carbon markets, it was possible for the aviation industry to use them and then sell them in the allowance system as the only industry. But this will probably change in 6 months. So in practice, how do you sell carbon credits? Well, first, you need to get the biochar certified. In Europe, this could be through the EBC, the European Biochar Certificate. Then you need to check that the biomass is sustainable and that the biochar quality is of a certain level. After that, you need to get the carbon sink certified. So if you have a ton of biochar and you place it in the soil, then you would get, for example, a certificate of 3 tons of CO2 removed. And this needs to be certified. And then in the end, you can sell the credits either through carbon schemes, and there are a few options, or you can do it directly to companies. And there are quite a few examples of this being done already with big companies. So how long does it take and how much does it cost? Well, with the EBC, the price is about 2,300 euros and the time is about 1 to 2 months. These are just order of magnitudes, and this might be very different from other ways of doing it. Then, if we look at the potential market, then just think about how much you think the EU made in income from this EU ETS system. So the EU system for carbon credits, how much money do you think they made? The answer is 14 billion euros. So this is quite a big market, and that's last year. So the EU learned from their experience, and now the price for 1 ton of CO2 is being traded for about 27 euros per ton, whereas in the beginning of the EU ETS, in 2001, 2005, it was only 5 euros. So they really learned from their experience, and the good thing about it is that at least half of this income will be used for climate projects. So one of the important points today is that there is a lot of money available in funding, and this should really be utilized. And here you can see an example of minimum 7 billion, but actually this number is much higher because the different countries have chosen to give more or put more money aside. Just one example is that last week the EU announced, will put 30 million euros aside specifically for CCS projects, carbon capture and sequestration. And there are only 3 to 5 CCS technologies. So this is really great news for biochar. And the deadline is in November 2020. You just need to make a short suggestion of what your project is about. And then you have until March 2021 to create a real detailed proposal. But for the potential market, we need to remove all human emissions. And now it's about 40 gigatons of CO2 per year. And we also need to remove all the extra ones. You saw this on the slide with the 800,000 years of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So if we just start with 40 gigatons, let's say an average price of 25 euros per ton, that's a potential market of 1,000 billion euros. That's 1 trillion euros. And then you might ask, well, are people gonna offset their emissions? Well, if we look at Delta Airlines, they already bought 12 million carbon credits since 2012. And they did it directly from a project and not from a carbon scheme. So if we take a lower price of 10 euros per ton, because as I just mentioned, the prices fluctuate a lot and they increased a lot 3 years ago, but before that it was lower. So for 10 euros per ton, that is 120 million euros that they spend on offsetting. And for this reason, they could say we have a carbon neutral growth. And now, of course, their goal is to be carbon neutral by 2030. And as a note, the aviation industry could use carbon offsets in the EU ETS market, and this will probably change. If we have a quick look at the existing market, then we have the biochar prices for soil applications in euros per ton. If you buy a small amount, it's expensive. If you buy a large amount, it's less expensive. So it could be, let's take the minimum prices. It could be 4,200 euros per ton. It could be 1,000 euros per ton. And if you look at biochar prices for animal feedstock, this is much higher. So this is, let's take a minimum price of 13,000 euros per ton. That's no, sorry, yes, 13,000 euros per ton. It's quite nice. And if you have it for cats and dogs, it's 79,000 euros per ton. And yeah, and the last one is animal feedstock. If you buy it in large quantities, it could be down to about 1,000 euros per ton as well. So I think it's nice just to take 1,000 euros per ton as a rule of thumb, and then you can always make more. Then I want to share some success stories for inspiration. If we have Charline, they sell biochar for animal fodder, and that costs between 85,000 and 170,000 euros per ton for cat and dog food. So yeah, I'm sorry, there's a little glitch between this number and this number. Oh, sorry, it's because it's an average. So in the existing market, I calculated the prices based on 7 EU biochar companies, and here we have one specific example. So for the cat and dog, it could be 85,000 to 170,000 euros per ton. Then for livestock in larger quantities, 1,500 to 15,000 euros per ton. And all companies sell biochar for soil amendment. And then it's about 1,000 euros per ton. They say we can't meet the demand, so they have to buy from other biochar producers. That's great. And they've been in full operation since 2016. Then if we take, and that's a European company, if we take the example of a Canadian company, they make biocoal and biocoke. So they said they sell the biocoal for an Oregon coal plant, and then they have needed 13,000 tons of biochar for tests, and they cannot meet demand either. So the coal plant needs to buy more coal or biocoal from other people. And I estimated the price at 400 euros per ton based on coal prices. So here I write only an estimate of regular coal price of 40 euros per ton, plus different taxes and transportation. But in reality, this number is higher when you take other things into account. And then if you use biocoke for metallurgy, it needs to have a much higher energy content. Then price of competitor coke is 130 euros per ton. Cool. Finally, we have Carbofex, and they use carbon offsetting. So they use a voluntary scheme, and they make 32 euros per ton CO2 on average. So this is about 100 euros per ton biochar, because I remind you that 1 ton of biochar is about 3 tons of CO2, depending on the amount of carbon. And Carbofex has the largest capacity in Europe. They have the capacity of 900 megatons biochar per year, and this could translate into 90 billion euros per year. So this just gives an order of magnitude. And of course, this market is emerging, but as you can imagine, once many companies are saying we want to be carbon neutral, and we are, then other companies need to follow as well to attract customers and employees. They also sell their biochar for multi-purpose, meaning you can use it for what you want, at 1,000 euros per ton. And it's also acknowledged for animal food. They use it for horticulture and water filtration. Then, on a final point, I want to show you the biochar stakeholders and the whole biochar ecosystem. So there's a lot of stakeholders involved. First, you need the people with biomass and biowaste. They need to find somebody who knows how to make pyrolysis, and then together they can produce biochar. Once you produce biochar, you sell it to the biochar user, or you simply use it yourself if that creates more value. For example, you could have a farm, give it to your animals, put it in the soil, increase the yield of both things. But you need to also make more revenue from selling carbon credits And there are other byproducts. So when you produce biochar in the process, you also produce heat, electricity, and fuel. And then you'll get savings from disposing of the waste, if it's waste. So this is important. But we also have the legal aspect, and the legal aspect is very complicated. I've spoken to many people from Denmark and EU, and they are also a little bit confused about it. But the most important points are that you need to a certifier or a verificator who certifies the pyrolysis, that it's safe and clean, certifies the biochar, that it's safe and clean and of a certain quality, and you need to certify the carbon credits. So if you calculate, or another company calculates, that 1 ton of biochar is the same as 3 tons of CO2 removed from the atmosphere, this needs to be certified by a third party. The certifier is accredited by an accreditation body, which is a nationally decided body. And in Denmark, that is DANAC, Danish accreditation, and they're the only ones who are allowed to do it. And it's the same for other European countries. Then we have other stakeholders, which are the investment and funding and the research community, so that depending on the level of ambition, you can produce new products based on biochar. I just mentioned a few applications, but you can make bioplastics, you can make fuel cells, and a lot of exotic things. Then you need the research community, and there's a lot of funding available. But of course, you need to know these things. Then at the heart of the system, we have the policymakers. They make goals, and they have the power to make or break this system. If they pass laws that incentivize the production of biochar, that's great. And they can do that through carbon taxes. So the higher the carbon taxes, the more interest there is for companies to reduce emissions, reduce net emissions, and offset. And also prices. So depending on the prices they put on heat, electricity, fuel, etc., this will drive the system. And finally, you can see that there are all these different stakeholders, but it's very hard just for somebody with biomass to know about all these other people, and it's quite a big challenge to say, now I want to start producing biochar when there's just so much to find out. And the knowledge is dispersed everywhere with more than 20,000 scientific publications and no centralized center of knowledge. So what you need is a person who has all this knowledge in one place and connected to all the different stakeholders. I've chosen to call this person a consultant, in the lack of a better word. And in Denmark, there is no consultants at the moment. That's why I created a team based on the knowledge we've built up now. And we already see some really, really good results working with different biochar producers, that there is a real need to find out how can you make most of your biochar. And on a world scale, there are not many consultants and nobody in Denmark at the moment. So then, with that remark, I just want to say thank you very much for listening. I'm open for questions. You're welcome to contact me either by email or telephone at any time. And then I'll be happy to share what I know. Thank you very much.